Okay. Hi, guys. This is my first presentation. Um, and I also just want to preface this by saying I haven't taken any database classes, so everything is from my own research. So if I get anything wrong, just let me know. All right, who am I? Oh, okay, it is slow. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, so I'm a first-year software engineering student, really big into CTFs, into baking. As you can see, all these things I've made. I like rock climbing, board games, Dungeons and Dragons, and tea. Yes, Will? Favorite thing I've baked? Um, Probably like the flan that I've made. That's pretty good, and it's like pretty straightforward too. Okay, so first let me just talk about like what is SQL. This is a definition from AWS, but SQL, from my understanding, is essentially a database programming language. So it can be used to interface with databases, send requests, and it comes in a lot of different flavors, implementations by like different companies and people who've made different versions of it. So just a basic introduction on how it works. This is a basic SQL query. And so for this example, it says select star, which means all columns, and then from customers, which is the table, and it would return something that looks like this. So all of the columns from the customers table. And so basically, you do something on like a website, for example, and then the query will be sent through like backend stuff and get to a database. And the database will return with some sort of request or react in some way, depending on the query. So here's just a basic query breakdown. Like I said before, the select star means all of the columns. Then you specify from the table, which in this case is users. And if this is, for example, a basic password, username and password form, and you specify John Doe and a password mypass, then it would look for in the name column something that equals John Doe, and then a password that equals mypass. And if both of those were true, then you'd be authenticated and logged in. So what is a SQL injection? So essentially, malicious actors will use forms on a website or something which interacts with a query. Yeah, there's a malicious actor on there. And it'll be sent to the database, and they can typically use something to bypass the authentication and log in as an administrator in this case. So here's a basic test to see if a form is vulnerable, for example. So like before, we have John Doe and mypass, but if we're using, in this case, a single quote after John Doe, you can see that the quotation mark will be like, it'll be one for under like John Doe, and then two more over here, and an extra one, which will cause an error because there's an open string. So here's actually a query with an injection. In this case, we'll do the same thing, add an extra quotation, and put in some logic. And by adding a certain number of quotations, we have one for John Doe. There's still the two over here for mypass, and then there's these two ones to complete this extra statement. So essentially, we've injected code into the query, in this case, or 1 equals 1. And so by doing something like this, we can bypass authentication. I will show right here. So first, it'll evaluate between the John Doe, the and statement between the name and the password. This will, in this case, evaluate to false because there's not something in the database that matches. After that, it'll go to the logic that we injected, and in this case, it'll evaluate to true because we'll look for user John Doe or 1 equals 1. 1 equals 1 is always true, so it will evaluate to true and authenticate us. So just a couple different types of injections. There's like broader types like blind injections, in band, out of band. Some of these fall under different ones. I'll just describe like basically what they are. Boolean, like I just showed before, uses logic to evaluate something and bypass authentication. Same with, then there's like union operators and error, which are used for gaining information. Error, essentially, you input something and see how the server responds, and based off that, you can figure out if it's vulnerable or not. Union operator essentially unions different data together from different tables that you may not normally have access to, and you can get more things, more info from that. Out of band, Essentially, you input into your query something which interfaces with some outside server to retrieve information, and time delay is used to essentially delay answers, so put the server to sleep, and then that way you can test if a field is actually vulnerable or not, even if you don't get a response. So here's another basic injection. This one just uses a comment in this version of SQL. So by just adding the extra quotation and the dash dash, it comments out the rest of the injection, just looks for, or the rest of the query, and just looks for a user named John Doe. And if it finds that, then it'll log you in. These are some common bypasses. Depending on what version of SQL is running, commenting might be different. So the first top ones are just different kinds of comments. The rest of them are, again, the same thing, using 1 = 1, different versions of SQL. And so more on union injections. Basically, the way they work is by unioning 2 different tables together. Typically, the server may ask for one table, and by using a union, you're able to take data from another table and combine it with those columns that are in the one that it's normally returning, and, for example, get usernames and passwords. To do this, you have to do a little bit of reconnaissance. So first, you need to figure out how many columns there are. You can use the order by whatever, like some amount, inject that into the query, and this will it'll return essentially it'll say if it can order a column or not, by whatever the column is. So if you order by 1, it'll order by column 1, order by 2 by column 2, and depending on how what it returns, if it says order by column 4 and it says column 4 doesn't exist, then you can figure out through trial and error how many columns there are. And then after that, you need to figure out what data types, because when unioning columns, they have to have the same data types. So in this example, it's going to do the same table from before and union with just 2 strings, A and A. And if we don't get any errors, then we know that they're both string-based in those columns. So then we can go from there to a union statement like this, where let's say we know that there's a table called members and columns name and pass, and we know that it's those 2 columns and each of them contains strings. Then we can union name and pass to header and txt and be able to print out name and pass when it's returned. So on top of that, SQL map is a nifty little tool you can use. It essentially, you just provided a URL, and there's a bunch of other options that you can specify in here, and it'll look through a site, see if it has vulnerable forms, depending on what kind of vulnerabilities there are. If it's a blind injection where you don't get any response, you may have to pass it more things like data or cookies, because some cookies are vulnerable to SQL injections. So it depends what you're looking for. There's also a wizard, which just makes a easy first-time use. So in terms of mitigation, there's a number of different things that you can do. Sometimes you can't always use all of them. It really depends. So there's parameterized queries, which is not directly concatenating the user input right into the query. So I'll show it off more, but essentially taking the user input and putting it in as a parameter to actually use it as a proper string and not just putting it right into the query. You can sanitize user input, which is essentially preventing certain characters or modifying those dangerous characters to make it so they aren't a problem in a string. Obviously, limiting privileges can stop users, even if they gain access, stop what they can do once they're in. And also restricting error messages is a super easy way to stop malicious actors from gaining more info. They don't know exactly if a field is vulnerable or not, so that can be really beneficial. So here's an example of a parameterized query. So in this case, it will do an HTTP request to get a name, and then it will prepare a query right there, and then it will pre-compile it on the server. And so then after that, it will replace the parameter with what the user inputted, and then it will execute the query. And in this case, because you're parameterizing it, using it as a parameter instead of just directly concatenating it, it'll put it in as a string instead and not just run the code that they input. Another thing you can do, sanitizing escaping, like I said before. You can ban symbols, or I don't know entirely how it's done, but this is just what I'm assuming is a possibility of just iterating over their input. And if you find a character like a single quote or any other things that could cause issues, just escaping them, replacing them with their escape variants so they actually work in a string. And so yeah, I'm going to show a little demo. So this website, Alturo Mutual, it's a fake demo website, as you can see in the top right. It's like a little banking app, but we can pull up the sign-in right here. And as you can see, you can put in whatever username. And so if I just try like basic, just like admin, and then I would just put for a password test, it's not going to work. But if I specify, for example, one of the injections like I showed before, so admin, and then a single quote, and then I comment out the rest of the query, doesn't matter what I put in for the password, and I do log in, it will actually let me get in. And if I try with another injection that I was showing before, like a logic one, so if I put in the admin username, and then or 1 equals 1, which will, like I said before, evaluate to true, put in whatever for the password, log in, also lets me in. So feel free to go to this website and just try out some different injections. I'm sure there's a number of them that work. Those are just a few that I showed. Yeah, that's everything.